The behavioral biases of individuals. Behavioral biases can either be cognitive or emotional. Cognitive biases can further be divided into belief preservation biases or information processing biases. With belief preservation biases, people hold on to original beliefs and react selectively to new information. Information processing biases can arise because people process information incorrectly. These are also called statistical errors, or these can happen because of memory errors or faulty reasoning. Emotional biases are biases influenced by feelings and emotion, and generally these arise when people are trying to avoid pain or produce pleasure. Here are the specific biases under each category. So these are the cognitive belief preservation biases, these are the cognitive information processing biases, and these are the emotional biases. Now let's talk about those three categories, starting with cognitive belief preservation biases. Here are the specific biases that you need to be aware of. Conservatism. This is where a client might maintain prior views by inadequately incorporating new information. So conservative means that he or she holds on to prior views, and that's what's described here. Examples would be holding on to winners or losers for too long. So if somebody thought that a given stock was really good, then despite new information coming in, the person holds on to that stock. And similarly, people with this bias will tend to underreact to new information. Confirmation. This is where a client might look for and notice what confirms his or her prior beliefs. Such clients focus on confirmatory or positive information about existing investments, and they tend to then overreact to information that confirms what they believe in or is perceived by them to be positive information. Hindsight bias. This is where a client might see past events as having been predictable, and an example would be overestimating the degree to which prior events were predictable. Illusion of control. This has to do with the false belief that one can influence or control outcomes, and an example would be a feeling of control over a company where one works. So if the CEO of a company believes that he has strong influence over the company where he works, then he might end up buying a lot of stock in that company. Representativeness. This has to do with classifying new information based on past experiences. Examples would be looking for patterns in new information that matches the patterns that one is already comfortable with. Over optimism about past winners. Treating small samples as representative of the entire population. Investing in companies that remind one of successful clients. So these are all scenarios that are possible under this sort of bias. Now you can remember this term see, her. So this stands for conservatism, confirmation, hindsight, illusion of control, and representativeness. So the point is that you need to know which biases fall in this category, and see, her can help you do that. Next we come to cognitive information processing biases. The framing bias has to do with answering a question differently based on how it is asked or framed. For example, if A and B are two stocks which are very similar, and the way information about these stocks is framed is that A has a 20% chance of a loss and B has a 80% chance of not resulting in a loss. So it's the same information but framed differently. If we have a risk averse client, then that client might pick B because the information about B is framed in a more positive manner, whereas the information about A is framed in terms of a loss. Anchoring and adjustment. This has to do with the incorrect use of psychological heuristics. This is where a client might place a very high weight on an anchor and underreact to new information. So for example, if a client buys a stock for 50, then this price of 50 might become an anchor for the client, where even if the stock goes down to 40, the client thinks that it will go back up and then refrains from selling that stock. Mental accounting. This is where different sums of money are treated differently depending on their source of use. In terms of the source of money, let's say that there are three major sources: current income, the assets that one owns, and the present value of future income. Now, if these are treated differently, whereby somebody spends all of current income on consumption and does not spend any money that comes from his or her assets, and also does not spend based on the present value of future income, then this person is exhibiting mental accounting bias. In terms of the use of money, if different buckets of money or different categories of money are invested differently, for example, if some money is invested very conservatively, and then at the same time there is a portfolio which is invested in speculative stocks, then that would be an example of mental accounting. Availability. This is where a client is influenced by how easily an outcome comes to mind. Somebody who is exhibiting this bias will place a high weight on easily available information. For example, such a person might easily be influenced by advertising. Such clients will select alternatives with which they have greater resonance. In other words, they can relate to these alternatives. They might also select alternatives that are easily retrievable or easily recallable. You can remember these four biases using the acronym FAMA. So framing, anchoring and adjustment, mental accounting, availability. So remember, FAMA is for cognitive information processing biases. Emotional biases. So these are the emotional biases. Loss aversion. So clients who have this bias will prefer avoiding losses over achieving gains. They will hold on to losing stocks too long and sell winning stocks too early. This is also called the disposition effect. Overconfidence has to do with the unwarranted faith in one's abilities. There are two subcategories here: illusion of knowledge and self-attribution. Illusion of knowledge has to do with the thought that one has more knowledge than one actually has. And self-attribution has to do with unduly attributing success to one's own abilities and attributing failure to bad luck. Now, this bias might lead to excessive trading, where somebody thinks that they are very knowledgeable or their cognitive skills are very high, so they end up trading more often than they need to. When they make predictions, they tend to have very narrow confidence intervals, so they might predict that a given stock will go up and the price range will be between 50 and 52. They also tend to assign high probabilities of success, so they are very confident in their own ability to predict, and they will assign high probabilities to their own success. Self-control bias has to do with a lack of self-control. So such people fail to act in pursuit of their long-term goals. They focus on short-term satisfaction and fail to save enough for the future. The endowment bias is where people value an asset more when they hold the rights to it. So if somebody inherits the shares in their father's company and see this as a source of family pride and hold on to these shares even though it doesn't align with their risk return objectives, then they are exhibiting an endowment bias. Regret aversion has to do with avoiding the pain of regret associated with bad decisions. If you have a client where a prior decision resulted in a loss and that loss caused regret such that it stops the client from making a similar decision, then this client is exhibiting regret aversion. Another scenario will be where a client is upset if he sells a share and then it goes up. And finally, status quo. So this is where a client does nothing rather than make a change. So if a client holds on to securities even though they are no longer consistent with his risk and return objectives, then he is exhibiting a status quo bias. An implication of the status quo bias is that a client will trade very infrequently. You can remember these biases through the acronym LOSERS. So loss aversion, overconfidence, self-control, endowment, regret aversion, and status quo. When dealing with client biases, an important decision is whether we should try and moderate the biases versus adapting the client's portfolio to biases. When we talk about moderating biases, what we are saying is that we counsel our client and educate our client in order to reduce the impact of those biases. Adapting a portfolio to biases is saying that the client's biases are not going to go away, so we take those biases into account when we construct a portfolio for the client. Now, this decision of whether to try and moderate the biases or adapt the portfolio depends on two factors. One is the client's level of wealth, and the other is the type of biases. In terms of wealth, if the client has high wealth, then he or she will have a low standard of living risk, and it makes sense to adapt to the biases. On the other hand, if the client has low wealth, then the standard of living risk tends to be high. In such cases, we should try and moderate the biases. The other dimension is the type of bias. It's hard to educate a client out of an emotional bias. So if a client is exhibiting emotional biases, it makes sense to adapt to the biases and construct a portfolio that accounts for those emotional biases. On the other hand, with cognitive biases, it is relatively easy to educate the client and counsel the client and get them to moderate or reduce their biases. So with cognitive biases, we should try and moderate. That is it for this reading.